Good evening, everyone. Michalis Raptis. I hope you're all well and have had an enjoyable Easter break. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's seminar, which is to be delivered by Hall Greenland, entitled "The Odyssey of Michel Pablo Raptis." This presentation is based on his recently released book, The Well-Dressed Revolutionary, The Odyssey of Michel Pablo in the Age of Uprisings. It's a fascinating read, and we've got a few copies available at a reasonable price for you all, and we encourage you all to purchase a copy at the end of the evening. You also have the author here to sign it too. Before we move to tonight's seminar, some household items. Next Thursday's 8th of May seminar will be by Dr. Michalis Raptis from the University of New South Wales on the mystique of Buddhism in the oeuvre of Nikos Kazantzakis, one for Kazantzakis aficionados. For the month of May, all 5 Thursday seminars will be held at the mezzanine level. We have local speakers or interstate speakers. Then we move online in June, and then the winter break in July before we resume in August. With respect to tonight's seminar, I would like to thank our sponsors, Kostas Stefanidis, and I'll invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. And just a reminder, there are tickets available for the GCM theatre production Girls in Crisis, Odyssey se Krisi, which will be hosted at Doncaster Playhouse Theatre from the following weekend onwards. Now, let's return to tonight's topic and welcome our interstate speaker, Hall Greenland. And what a fitting topic on Michalis Raptis, or Michel Pablo, being May Day today. Hall is an award-winning Australian journalist, historian and political activist. He was one of the founders of the Greens. In the 1960s, he participated in the Freedom Bus that helped reignite the struggle for self-determination by Australia's First Nations peoples. And he has served as a councillor in various inner-city councils. As a feature writer on the Bulletin from 1999 to 2008, he won 2 Walkley Awards. He's also the author of 2 books, one on Pablo, mentioned before, and Red Hot, The Life and Times of Nick Oreglas, which is shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's History Prize in 1998. Our topic today is, as I said before, Michel Pablo, a Greek revolutionary born in Alexandria in 1911. It still had a very vibrant Greek population that early part of the 20th century. In many ways, he was a man ahead of his time. Like many leftists in the 1930s, he suffered and was exiled during the reign of Ioannis Metaxas before escaping to France. Sometimes some historians people try to sugarcoat the reign of Metaxas. He wasn't as fully fascist as Mussolini or Hitler. Bravely, he responded to the Axis powers with his Oichi communique. But don't underestimate the brutality and dislocation that occurred during this period, a gruesome period for anyone that was on the left. Very early on, he was able to recognize, this Michel Pablo, the importance of anti-colonial struggles, their global ramifications, and their future impact on Western powers. Don't forget that at the end of World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War, it ushered in many anti-colonial and independence struggles in almost every part of the globe. In Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, there were anti-imperial struggles worldwide. Pablo wasn't content on being an observer and commentator. He had to be a participant as well. He worked as an advisor for Algeria's first post-colonial president, Ahmed Ben Bella, and the Chilean socialist government of Salvador Allende. While he also enjoyed a strong friendship with PASOK leader Andreas Papandreou. I could go on with more details about this fascinating activist, but I won't steal the speaker's thunder. So a big round of applause for our speaker tonight, Hall Greenland.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all coming out tonight. Thank you, Nick, for the invitation. Yes, you're probably wondering, somebody's already asked me, what's a Anglo boy from inner Sydney doing writing about Michel Pablo, who was a cosmopolitan revolutionary who lived in the 20th century, a long way from Sydney, from the inner west in Sydney. From my troubles as a young person, I became a left-winger in the Labor Party, where I met a man called Nick Origlas, who had been a workers' leader in the shipyards of Balmain, and also had become, and for 35 years he remained, the councillor for Balmain on the Leichhardt Council. He was a mayor a couple of times, and he was a great admirer and follower of a man called Michel Pablo. So as a student in the mid-60s in Sydney, I was introduced to this weird and wonderful Greek revolutionary, Michel Pablo, who wrote in French and who Nick Origlas translated or transliterated word for word into English. But I got the general idea of what he was about. And when I went to Paris in 1968, one of the reasons I went was the big student uprising and general strike going on as well, which was another reason I was there. But the chief reason, from my point of view, was to meet the fabled, legendary Michel Pablo, which I did. And I didn't realise until I met him that he had an equally significant other, that he was married to a woman who was fondly and widely known as Elly, who was a bit of a spitfire and was an essential partner to Michel. And a French critic who's just reviewed the book, the English language version of the book, claimed that Pablo, in fact, wasn't Michalis Raptis, but was Michalis Raptis and Elly Diovouniotis as well, that he was actually a composite figure. I don't go that far in the book. He was very, very important in his life, and I think we have to acknowledge and recognise that. She was also very rich, which meant, and we'll come to this in a minute, Pablo was 51 before he actually had paid employment, because he was married to a very outspoken but very rich Greek woman, who meant that he was able to work as a full-time revolutionary. Some of you will have come across him later in life when he was a newspaper correspondent in Athens. He had a column in not one but two Greek newspapers, Tovima and Tarnia. He must have been the only declared revolutionary Marxist in the world to have a newspaper column in a daily newspaper, not in just one, but in two as well. And when he died, not only did ambassadors from a number of countries come to the funeral in Athens, but half the cabinet turned up, and even a conservative journal like Kathimerini in Athens carried an obituary for Pablo on the front page and called him a citizen of the world, which he would have liked, although I think it's more accurate to say that he was a cosmopolitan internationalist revolutionary, and he had been since the 1930s, as Nick alluded. It's appropriate, as Nick said, I think, to have this talk on the 1st of May. Pablo was a Greek, he was a revolutionary socialist, he was an internationalist, and so having this talk on the 1st of May, the International Workers' Day, is, it seems to me, very, very appropriate. I must apologise in advance if I mangle the Greek pronunciation of words as I go through. I suppose the confession I should make is that books like this aren't the work of a single person, although I get my name in lights, so to speak. Fortunately, I had French and Greek friends who were only too willing to seek out information, send to me, and to do translations, particularly, French is fine, but particularly from Greek. So that's a great piece of luck I had, having those friends that I had accumulated over the years, and they made it possible for a boy from the inner west in Sydney to do this. I did it during, did the research and wrote the book during COVID, which is also something I'd promised to do for a long time, and I thought somebody else would write this incredible yarn of Pablo's life, but nobody did. So it fell to me during COVID. I was locked up. What else would you do but write the biography that you'd been promising to do for a couple of decades? And it was good because archivists and librarians around the world were shut during that time, and so they're only too willing to ferret out material, scan it, and send it to me. So I think I should, I've assembled a sprawling saga, if you like, or Odyssey of Pablo's life, but considering the time may well be too short to go through every single slide that I've got, I thought I might start with Algeria, because when the Algerian War broke out in 1954, Pablo was 43 years old, and if you like, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers. And for the next 10 or 11 years, he was deeply involved in the Algerian revolution. I'll just go to a later slide. I'll come back to these slides, but it's a kind of preview in fast motion. To Algeria. Algeria was, as some of you might know, the last remaining major colony of France. I call it a colony, but the French didn't call it a colony. For France, it was part of France itself, and actually sent representatives to the French Parliament. But in 1954, an armed rebellion broke out in Algeria for independence. Algeria at that time had 8 or 9 million Arabs, if you like, or indigenous Algerians, and 1 million European settlers. The Algerians had been denied equal rights and equal say in their country for more than 120 years. The French had colonised the country back in the 1830s and kept a tight grip on the country. The war broke out. It was a very, very vicious and dirty war. Some 400,000 French troops were stationed in Algeria to put down the rebellion. Some 2 million people were uprooted from their villages. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. Torture was inflicted on Algerian prisoners on an industrial scale. Some 200,000 Algerians, at least 200,000, died, and some 20,000 French soldiers as well. Now, how did Pablo become involved in what was a particularly dirty and dangerous war? Well, in 1954, the Algerian rebels decided they must make contact with their fellow Algerians in France. There was something like 300,000 French workers doing the dirty work in the factories of France, 300,000 of them. And the Algerian leaders of the independence struggle decided that they needed money to buy arms and support for diplomatic missions abroad and so on. And the only way they could get that money for arms and for diplomatic representation abroad and so on was by taxing the Algerian workers in France itself. And they needed help in order to do this. And so in Christmas of 1954, they made contact with Michel Pablo and asked for his help. Pablo didn't have a great support network. He had 20 or 30 close comrades in Paris and various other parts of France at the time, and they swung into action. They did extraordinary work for the Algerians. They set up a secret printery for the Algerians, which the French police did not discover in the 7 to 8 years of the war. They forged passports and IDs for the Algerians. They printed their leaflets. They printed their magazines and newspapers. They delivered them. They collected the taxes in suitcases and ferried it to Swiss banks, where it was put into Swiss accounts. They hid fugitives from the French police in their homes and in their apartments and so on. They did extraordinary work in supporting the Algerians. The Algerians, however, were hard pressed by 1958 because they were virtually without arms, because the Soviet bloc had decided not to support the Algerian struggle for independence and freedom, because they were cozying up to General de Gaulle and the French in the hope of splitting the Atlantic Alliance, in hoping to win him away to a more neutral position in the Cold War contest with the United States. So there were no arms coming from the Soviet bloc, none from China either. And so the Algerians relied on the Yugoslavs and on arms dealers who were a very shady bunch in Western Europe for their arms. Unfortunately for the Algerians, the French Navy intercepted most of the boats carrying arms to the Algerians. So they were in hard-pressed position in 1958. The other thing was, by 1958, the French secret police had set up a terrorist organisation called the Red Hand, which in its 4 or 5 years of existence assassinated hundreds of Algerians and Europeans. They specialised in blowing up or gunning down European arms dealers. So by the end of 1958, the hard-pressed Algerian fighters in the mountains and the interior of Algeria, fighting 400,000 French troops, were crying out for arms. And it was a very dangerous time, but Pablo decided and made the offer to the Algerian government in exile in Tunis to set up the Algerians' own armaments factory, or industry, if you like, in Morocco itself. It was an extraordinary undertaking. He had to source a machine gun, and that was the main weapon that the Algerians used, a copy of the French, the one the French used, so that they could raid the armories of the French and get the bullets that would fire out of the machine guns. He had to take it apart. He had to get designers to design it, and then he had to find the machines, the lathes and so on to produce it. He then had to secretly transport them from Western Europe into Morocco, into a factory specially built in an orange grove near the border of Algeria. And then he had to recruit the specialist workers, 20 or 30 Trotskyists, if you like, from around the world, from Europe, basically from Europe and from Latin America, came, and some 300 or 400 Algerian workers. They produced thousands of these weapons and saved the bacon of the Algerian resistance, the Algerian revolutionaries fighting for independence and freedom in Algeria. It was undiscovered by the French. It wasn't bombed, it wasn't raided, and it succeeded in what it did. The account of what happened, how this was done, and what it was like to be in these factories was something that wasn't really revealed until 30 or 40 years later by a Greek, by Dimitri Livieratis, who was a comrade of Pablo's and who was the manager, if you like, of the factory itself. And in 2002, he published a book, The Invisible Factory. It was invisible because it was invisible from the French, and it wasn't something that Pablo and his comrades who were in France wanted to advertise, because they were producing guns that were shooting French soldiers. So it was invisible in France as well to the general public. So it wasn't really publicised until 2002 when the book came out, and then 10 years later there was a French edition as well. Pablo, of course, did not escape unscathed. In June of 1960, he was arrested in Amsterdam on 3 charges. 1, illegally exporting machines to make munitions. 2, forging passports and identity cards. And 3, counterfeiting French francs. For a year, he dwelt in prison. It was a year before he came to trial. During that time, there was an international campaign led by Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir to have him released. It was a very big campaign. A dozen Labor MPs from Britain were also involved in the campaign to free Michel Pablo and Sal Santon, his Dutch comrade, who was in prison with him as well on the same charges. It was expected that he would, in fact, get a sentence of between 3 and 10 years. As it turned out, the judge decided that he was guilty on all 3 charges, and he was sentenced to 15 months. In other words, he still had 3 months to serve because he'd already served a year. It was considered to be a very signal victory for civil liberties and for the Algerian resistance in Europe. During the year he was in prison, he wrote a series of essays, one on Plato, one on Freud. But the most famous of the essays that he wrote while he was in prison was on the liberation of women. It seems to me to be justly famous because he recognised and celebrated the possibility of a mass women's liberation movement arising in Europe and North America. He thought it was a very, very possible thing. And he thought this movement would not only be aiming for economic and social liberation for women, but sexual liberation as well. It was a very daring idea in the late 1950s to be talking about the sexual freedom of sexual freedom for women. He also anticipated the arrival of the pill. In the essay, he thought it was only a matter of time before scientists found a way for women to avoid unwanted pregnancies by taking some kind of medication. In addition to that, he also argued that especially for men on the left, the personal was political, that you could tell the worth of a revolutionary by the way he treated and the way he regarded women and children, and that was much more important than all the left-wing talk or principles or rhetoric that he might sprout, that his personal behaviour was of signal importance. And in that essay, of course, anticipated the second wave feminism, the women's liberation movement that broke out only another 6 or 7 years later in North America and in Western Europe. After he was released from prison, he went first to Morocco and then spent about a year there before Algeria got its independence, and he went to Algeria in August of 1962. Algeria then was called the Mecca of revolution. Probably, this is something that's not well known, but people like Nelson Mandela, Yasser Arafat, and the leaders of the liberation movements in Africa and the Middle East, and in Portugal as well, and Latin America, made their way to Algiers at some stage or other in order to get support, to get training, to set up pirate radio stations, and so on. And it was Algerian ships that would take arms to rebels and revolutionaries fighting in the jungles of Latin America. And one man who came there, of course, and you see it in the photo here, is Che Guevara. He visited Algiers on at least 2 occasions because he was aiming, and he did actually go to the Congo to restart the Congolese revolution. And he went, quite naturally, he went via Algiers. And in Algiers, of course, he met Pablo. And it was Pablo who was the middleman who arranged the Czech arms to go from Czechoslovakia to Algiers and then shipped on from there to eastern Congo. So they met a number of times and had long discussions and long arguments. But the thing that really drew Pablo to Algeria, and which was extraordinarily important, is that when Algeria got its independence, 90% of the million settlers up stakes and left Algeria. They weren't interested in living in a country where the natives, the indigenous Algerians, were ruling. So they packed their suitcases and went. Not only did they do that, they destroyed whatever they could in their wake. Even the academics from the University of Algeria and Algiers burnt down the library in Algiers. It was scorched earth. And they left a country in ruins, but one of the most extraordinary things in history, the farm workers and the factory workers in Algeria decided to organise themselves and take over and run the farms and factories themselves. And so the harvest of 1962, for instance, which everybody expected would not be able to be harvested and to be brought in and marketed and used to feed the population, that came in due to the efforts of the workers on the farms themselves. Of course, the best farms and the farms in the best areas who produced most of the agricultural products of France had been European owned. But the workers did it themselves. And Pablo's first job, and why he was hired to do, his first paid job in the end of 1962, was to draw up the rules and regulations for the new self-managed, the new direct democracy in the farms and factories of the abandoned properties that the Europeans had left behind. And, of course, what did he use as his model? ancient Greece, Athens. And so the key part of the management structure for these new self-managed farms and factories was the General Assembly. Every month there would be a General Assembly, and that's where the decisions were made. That's where the council or the executive elected by the general meeting, would report. That's where it would report. And so the laws, the March Decrees of 1963 that set this up and introduced this direct democracy into the most important parts of the Greek economy was inspired by a Greek and by Athens. That's his staff card as the economic counsellor for Ben Bella. I dug this photo out as well. Here are some of Pablo's comrades who joined him in Algiers and did various things. On the left-hand side, in the white shirt and tie with the big silly grin and the glasses, is Dennis Freeney, an Australian teacher and journalist who joined Pablo in. So there's an Australian connection as well. You Greeks haven't got it all to yourselves. The other thing I think is important to note is that this was not only a mecca for revolutionaries from all over the world to go there, not only was it the first example for a very long time of workers actually managing their workplaces and so on, and not only was there an explosion of political debate and newspapers and magazines, it was a time also when Algerian women entered into public life. And this is not a very good, I couldn't find better photos, unfortunately, but in International Women's Day of 1965, tens of thousands of women marched through the streets of Algiers calling for equality. And that, in the Arab world, as you know, was something of a signal event. Unfortunately, of course, I thought I had another slide just in here, I must have put it in. Unfortunately, as Pablo said often to Ben Bella, in a revolutionary situation, there are two currents. There's one that wants to go further, wants the revolution to be freer and more democratic, and there's another current that is more conservative, more authoritarian, more centralising. And that tension was there all the time in Algeria. And the second most powerful man in Algeria at the time after President Ben Bella was Boumediene, the Minister for Defence, who was a very dour and essentially very conservative man. And he and the fellow army officers were not great fans of self-management, were not great fans of women's liberation, and were not great fans of these Pierre Rouge, these atheist Europeans who seem to have so much influence with the president. The Pierre Rouge, I should explain, the Pierre Noir was what the settlers were called, and so after they left and these other Europeans came, these other communists and socialists and leftists of various kinds came, they got the nickname Pierre Rouge in French. And so in June of 1965, there was a coup, and Pablo had to go underground and make an escape and ended up in Switzerland. But I just tell that part of the story. It was a failure. And the number of times that Pablo was involved in revolutions that ended without a great success, whether it was Portugal in the 70s or Chile, and he had great hopes for Papandreou and PASOK and so on in the 70s that were disappointed. His life, in a way, when you read it, and I'll come back to this, looks like a series of failures. And it is true, he was always searching for a successful revolution that would lead on to a form of socialism that was free, that was democratic, that expanded the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And he tried his whole life to do that. But I want to why I started with this is because there were two great successes, it seems to me, in his life. One was to recognise the liberation of women as a major thing that was going to happen in the 20th century and should be supported to the hilt by men and women on the left. And the second one was, and I think we don't realise this strongly enough, is the liberation of colonial peoples that Nick alluded to. 100 years ago, hundreds and hundreds of millions of Africans, Asians and Latin Americans were ruled by a small number of white countries. 100 years later, that kind of colonialism, that kind of imperialism no longer exists. It is, it's an extraordinary historical event that the liberation or the freedom of those people to determine their own destiny, they make all the mistakes and they have a terrible, terrible time in lots of places, but they are now in charge of their own destiny, which wasn't the case up until the middle of the 20th century. And it was one of Pablo's great accomplishments, I think, that he realised this and he chucked his energies into realising it and making sure it succeeded in one place where he could be, and that was in the struggle for Algerian independence and freedom. All right, so that's a core thing, keep that with you. I'll go back to is it okay if I keep on going, Nick? Okay. Yeah, all right. Alexandria. In August of 1911, Michalis Raptis was born in the city of Alexandria. Some of you will know the city of Alexandria. It's a fabled city. It's about 500,000 people lived in it in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The biggest community, expatriate community, were the Greeks. There were 35,000 Greeks, and amongst them were Pablo's parents. His father was a visiting civil engineer. He was there working on projects for the British, who were the colonial masters of Egypt at the time. And his mother was the daughter of 2 Cretans who'd eloped from Crete in the 1880s. His grandmother was in fact Jewish, but she converted to Orthodox in Alexandria when they arrived in 1886, and they married then, and the daughter became Pablo's mother. She was an educated woman. She spoke some Arabic, but she also spoke French fluently as well as Greek. And when he was about 3, they moved to Cairo. And the first memories Pablo has, hearing the roar of the animals in Cairo Zoo. They lived a block away. The other memory he has of that time, rather strange in a way, is being ferried to school on the shoulders of the black servant in the household in Cairo. But essentially he grew up in Crete, in the 3rd city of Crete, Aegean Nikolaos. It was an idyllic childhood he had. His father was hired again as an engineer to build roads and bridges in the interior of Crete, and often Pablo would accompany his father on his trips to the interior, where he met peasants and became sympathetic to the whole peasant class and their psychology, their love of independence and freedom, and so he was. This is the family at the time. That's his father and his mother. And that's his sister Olga on the left. And that's the cheeky one in the bottom right-hand corner is Michel, pulling a face. Even idyllic childhoods have their tragedies. Olga died soon after this photo was taken, but they had another child, a younger brother, Kletos, soon after Olga's death. The other thing that he was well aware of at the time, as a child, and had some sympathy for, was Spingalonga, I think it's called, the island, and not far from this town was the chief leper colony for Greeks, and it was he witnessed the boats coming and going, and it was something that that he felt a great deal of sympathy for. Here he is, even as a young boy at school, he was something of a dapper creature. I've got this picture of Tolstoy because the first master, the first great influence on Pablo was Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist. Tolstoy these days is known for War and Peace and Anna Karenina, but of course his other great novel was Redemption, which is about political refugees and peasants in Tsarist Russia. The other thing about Tolstoy, beside his great love for dissidents and for the Russian peasants and serfs, and his hatred of Tsarism and feudalism, was that he was an anarchist and a pacifist. And Pablo, I think, admitted in his autobiography printed in the 1980s that this Tolstoyan legacy remained part of his intellectual makeup throughout his life. It also inspired him to become a writer, and he helped set up a literary magazine when he was 14. When he was 16, his first public lecture was on Leo Tolstoy and his novels. And he wrote a number of short stories that were published, but 3 have remained in circulation. One's about about an unmarried mother and a child. Another one is about a long-term prisoner who commits suicide, and the other one is about a dissident priest who's an outcast in the mountains of northern Greece. So they're very Tolstoyan stories in their way, and they're about outsiders and marginals, and they are suffused with a great deal of sympathy for the people who we might call the downtrodden or the marginal people. Here's a picture of him, dapper, again with his mother, in Athens in 1929, before he went to university. I still got time? Yep. At university, he was supposed to be doing civil engineering at the Polytechnic, the famous Polytechnic in Athens. He was going to be a civil engineer like his father, but he got mixed up in the intellectual and political ferment at Athens University, and these 4 characters became his first great influences beyond Tolstoy. There was Freud, and right to the end of his life, he was a great admirer of Freud, that Freud had explored the soul of human beings and discovered how dark it was, that human beings had started by murdering each other, and there was evil at the base of human nature. But there was also what Freud called the superego, or the thrust to civilization and culture, which mostly kept the dark forces in the soul of men in particular under control. There was Marx, another influence he picked up in those first years at university, who saw, as you know, the economic basis of society and the forces and classes and their clashes as the motor of history. There was Lenin, who was a model revolutionary in his way, for all his downsides. And of course, there was Rosa Luxemburg. Of all the revolutionaries, famous revolutionaries of the early 20th century, his greatest affection, in a way, was for Rosa Luxemburg, who emphasised the democratic soul of socialism. If it wasn't democratic, it wasn't, as far as Rosa Luxemburg was concerned, it wasn't socialism. But, of course, in those days, the great contest in the left in Europe and in Greece was between Leon Trotsky and Stalin. And in that epic, if you like, political rivalry, Pablo became a follower of Trotsky. And essentially, the Trotsky credo of that time was capitalism had exhausted itself. It was the Great Depression. There were millions of people unemployed around the world. So capitalism was finished. Fascism was on the rise and had been successful, quite obviously, in Germany and in Spain, and that the communists and the socialist parties and their leaders had failed either to respond positively to the depression or to the rise of fascism. And so, for that reason, they needed a new revolutionary leadership, a new leadership of the left and of the labour movement, and the Trotskyists would supply it. That was the basis. For all, as the Metaxas dictatorship has already been referred to, and of course Pablo was rounded up at the end of 1936 along with thousands of other leftists, and he was shipped off to Folegandros, island in the middle of the Mediterranean. Some of you will know, 600 or 700 political prisoners there at the time. That's remarkably, there's a photo of a bunch of them arriving, and right in the middle, where else would he be, is Michel Pablo, and that's in the archives in Athens. Remarkably, again, also sent to Folegandros. One day he was sitting on the wall down in the harbour, and a boat came in, bringing the latest load of prisoners. And who should be standing in the prow of the ship but Elly? And so he'd already met her, and they'd already had a kind of fond friendship. But here they were on a prison island in the middle of the Mediterranean in 1937, and they had, quite frankly, and despite the fact that it was a prison island, a summer of love. And they formed a relationship on that prison island that lasted, of course, for the next 60 years. As Nick said, I mean, the Greek prisons of that time more like the Tsarist prisons. You know, it wasn't like the Stalin or Hitler's concentration camps or whatever. You went to the islands, and there was a very small police and army presence to keep an eye on you, but you were paid a living allowance, and you were expected on that living allowance to work with the locals either as farmhands or as electricians, if you're an electrician, or a fisherman or whatever, and to become part of the island economy. And that's how you lived. The trouble with Michel and Elly was that they were troublemakers, and so at the end of 1937 they were sent to separate prisons. Pablo was sent to Napoleon in the Peloponnese, which was an old medieval fortress converted into a prison. It was overcrowded, it was damp, it was dark, and he contracted TB, which nearly killed him in the few years that come. But at the end of 37, the beginning of 38, their families, both their families were well connected. Elly grew up playing with the children of the royal family. Her parents, her father and grandfather were deans of law at Athens University, and they could trace their ancestors back to participation in the Greek Revolution of the 1820s. And so they were released, and in early 1938 they went to Switzerland, and from there to Paris, where they married. It was a dangerous time in Paris and in Spain too in 1938, because Stalinists were murdering Trotskyists. And this photo, Trotsky himself was murdered by a hit squad from the KGB that's sent by Stalin to assassinate him in 1940. But the man on his right, Rudolf Clement, was the chief organiser for the Trotskyists in France in 1938, and he mysteriously disappeared, and a couple of weeks later, parts of his body started to wash up on the banks of the Seine. He had been assassinated, and his body had been butchered. So these were dangerous times, but Pablo managed to fall under the radar because he and Elly didn't register themselves. You had to register yourself if you were a foreigner in France at the time. Didn't register themselves as political refugees. They registered themselves as students, and in fact, they were students at the Sorbonne, and so they flew under the radar. However, Pablo, soon after the Germans had occupied France, became very sick and was on, by his own account, on the edge of death during the grim winter of 1940-41. But again, Elly came to the rescue and got him on the last train out of Paris in that winter, because they cut the rail connection between the German part of occupied France and the Vichy part of France, the collaborator part of France in the south. But on the last train south, Elly got him on with an old comrade of his, George Visitoris, I think his name is, and he went to a sanatorium on the border of Switzerland and France, and he spent 2 years there and recovered. While he was there, he did a course in statistics at the Sorbonne. There's another picture of him. The main thing that he was involved in during the war years was setting up the printery for the Trotskyists. Again, as I said before, he set up a printery in early 1943 that operated for two years under the nose of the Germans in Paris and was not discovered. The main thing that printery did, besides printing Trotskyist magazines, was to print a magazine for German soldiers, because in their view of the war would end like World War I. It would end in revolutions, and the principal revolution would be in Germany. So what did revolutionaries like Michel and others of his school think to do? Was to organise amongst the German workers in uniform, mostly in the fortresses and the camps along the English Channel. Unfortunately, the courier, one of the German soldiers who was coming to Paris to pick up copies of the newspapers, was intercepted by the Gestapo in October of 1943 and tortured, and gave up the addresses and names of a number of the leading Trotskyists in Paris, one of whom was Marcel Hick, who lived next door to Pablo on the left bank in Paris. And when the Gestapo raided Hick's place and arrested him, Pablo and Elly happened to be out. But as they approached the building in which the Gestapo was still ensconced, a woman who they didn't know passed them in the street and said, "Don't go home, the Gestapo are there," and just walked on. And so, by the kindness of a stranger, in a way, Pablo evaded, at that stage, the Gestapo. The paper continued to come out because the man who was responsible for it, Martin Monat, a German Jewish refugee, was not picked up in that original raid of October 1943, although he was arrested 6 months later. Well, and he was shot by the Gestapo, and his body was dumped in a park on the outskirts of Paris. Fortunately for him, a doctor happened to be walking in that park and discovered that Martin was still alive, despite the fact that he had half a dozen bullets in him, and took him to a hospital. And the word got to Pablo that Martin was still alive, and he organised a rescue operation. Pablo was always up for rescue operations or whatever. But by the time they got to the hospital, the Gestapo had beaten them to the punch, and Martin was taken away and properly shot this time. Pablo, of course, had no connections with Greece at this time because, it was there were no telephones or postal kind of services connecting revolutionaries in France to those in Greece, and no internet and so on, believe it or not. And despite the fact that it was a very heavily influenced or led resistance in Greece by the Stalinists, Pablo believed that it was possible for Trotskyists to join the mass resistance in Greece. They should. During World War II, I think some of you will probably know this, the strongest and biggest resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe were in Poland, Yugoslavia and Greece. And it was an extraordinary resistance in Greece. And what Pablo recognised about the resistances was not only did they have a mass character, despite their Stalinist or Gaullist leadership, is that there was a potential for revolutions inside those, that if the workers were going to rise and the workers and peasants were going to rise, risk their lives and fight to eject the Nazis, they would, after their victory, they would want some kind of socialism. And that was his view of things. And so he believed that the Trotskyists should join the resistances. He had a lot of pushback from his comrades, and they did agree with him eventually, but it was too late in the day. This Elly Diovouniotis was Pablo's favourite amongst the resistance chieftains. he was eventually betrayed by the Stalinists and killed by right-wing troops in 1946 in Greece. After the war, when the Trotskyists expected there would be revolutions, there were no revolutions. Capitalism got a new lease of life, as we know, and it took Pablo some time before he began to revise. And I mean, that quote I think is that's why the French edition of the book is called The Odyssey of a Trotskyist Heretic, because he was something of a heretic, because he decided that Trotskyism needed a lot of revision, and that that capitalism was still a viable system, that Trotskyists weren't going to be the saviours of the working class and of socialism. They had to work with other people. The Bolshevik experience of Lenin and Trotsky and so on had lost its relevance to the post-war world, and that the Soviet Union itself, one had to wonder how socialist it was and subject it to a Marxist analysis as well. And that most of all, Marxism was an experimental science, that it was a way of understanding the world and acting in it. He was a great supporter of de-Stalinisation of the Hungarian Revolution. He had this belief that the Soviet world, the Soviet bloc, was going to break up due to the efforts of some reforming bureaucrats and the people taking up the struggle and instituting real socialism. And Czechoslovakia, of course, 10 years, or in 1968, was a great example, great confirmation as far as he was concerned of his predictions of what was going to happen to the Soviet bloc. As we know, it didn't actually turn out like that. It turned out that the masses and a large part of the bureaucracy favoured a return to capitalism, which of course occurred 30 years later. I've already done this. Am I all right to do another 5 or 10 minutes? 5 minutes? All right. After 1965, after the defeat in Algeria, he returned. Gypsy years, he was a stateless person and wandered around with Elly. They ended up, that's him with his brother Kledos, they ended up in France for May 1968, the great general strike and the students' uprising and so on, which inspired him to believe that revolutions, especially revolutions for what he called a self-managed socialism, were possible. At the same time, in 1968, there was similar uprisings in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, the attempt to create socialism with a human face, which unfortunately did not come to fruition due to the Soviet intervention. He went to Chile. He was invited to Chile by President Allende, the socialist president, to draw up plans for self-management in Chile. Unfortunately, the coup of 1973 occurred, and that didn't go. He then found himself in Lisbon for the Carnation Revolution, the overthrow of the last of the fascist dictatorships in Europe, where there was an explosion of democracy. He became friendly with the key organiser of the coup that led to the Carnation Revolution, Tello de Carvalho, and there's a picture of him there. And then when he was in Lisbon, he got news that the junta, who he'd been helping to organise the resistance to, but not very successfully, had fallen, and his friend Andreas Papandreou had returned and had every prospect of becoming eventually the Prime Minister of Greece. Pablo never joined PASOK, but a lot of his comrades did. Unfortunately, Andreas decided to go to the right and purged Pablo's comrades at the end of 1976 from their positions in the party. By this stage, he was publishing books, Chile, this book, a collection of his essays. He also took great hope and inspiration from Solidarity, the uprising of workers in Poland in the 1980s, and the original aim of that Solidarity was for a self-managed socialist republic in Poland. As we know, that didn't come to pass either. And the main thing he did in Greece, besides being a newspaper columnist, was to set up what he called the Protagoras Circle, which held big public meetings about things like Poland or Nicaragua or the cruise missile crisis and so on in Europe. And here's one of the meetings, of course, he's sitting down the front. Protagoras was his favourite Greek political philosopher. Protagoras was Pericles' main advisor, and none of his writings survive. What we know about him is what we know via Plato, and essentially Protagoras believed that the gods had endowed every human being with the capacity to participate in the government of their community, and that what people like Protagoras and Pericles had to do was to, by education and by practice, bring out this capacity. But it was the inherent capacity of everybody to participate in the Athenian democracy. And of course, Pablo, believing in self-managed or direct democracy, socialism, found in Protagoras his favourite Greek philosopher. At the time, here's a bit of gossip for you, he took another very close female friend, as well as Elly, Marika Karageorgiou, who was a psychiatrist. He originally became friends with her father, who was a doctor. She was a psychiatrist, and her and Michel became very close in the last 12 years of his life. I think it was platonic, but we have no other records of it. Here he is with Marika, and that's Otello de Cavallo. Otello de Cavallo was recently released from prison. Again, Pablo led the international campaign to get him released from Portuguese prison, and that's in 1990 when he visited Pablo to thank him. Pablo also led the international campaign to get Ben Bella released after his 15 years in prison as well. He never forgot his friends. I forget who this is, but it's some PASOK.
PASOK minister.
PASOK minister. Pablo was friends with most of the aristocracy. Here he is in a cartoonist version of him. In 1990, he was accused of being the leader of November the 17th, the chief terrorist organisation. He sued the author, and while he won, the author countersued Pablo because Pablo called him a worm, and so Pablo was granted 1.5 million drachmas in damages, but Cyrus, the author, who'd been called a worm and was a worm, got 400,000 drachmas in. Pablo couldn't understand the Solomonic logic of this verdict, but he came out ahead. But unfortunately, Cyrus then appealed, so it was likely to drag on for some time. So in the end, Pablo settled for Botsaris withdrawing the book and Pablo apologising to Botsaris for calling him a worm. I'm just finishing now.
Just keep on.
Sorry, thank you. All those in favour, all those against, I'm nearly finished. Thanks, sorry. So he continued to write and to publish, to lecture all over Europe. He became something of a utopian in his latter years, believing that utopians had a real role to play. Those who were critical of the society they were in, who then imagined quite realistic alternative societies was something that the left needed and there wasn't enough of, and that in fact he himself was something of a utopian and dreaming of a recreation of a society based on Athenian democracy. Here he is in the streets of Kolonaki where he lived. They had a small flat there. He died of a heart attack that occurred in a coffee shop when he was having coffee one day in February of 1996. There's a photo that's often used in Greek sites which I pinched when they're discussing Pablo. One of the last things he did was to organise an international conference against the embargo of Iraq and Cuba. He did so not out of any sympathy for Saddam Hussein, but because the people who suffer from sanctions and embargoes are poor people, and people who need medical supplies and so on, and also leads to black markets and racketeering and so on. So he, along with Christopher Hitchens, people like Christopher Hitchens and Tony Benn and Michel Pablo, he organised international conferences against embargoes. 6 months before he died, he did a long 6-hour interview with Adolfo Gili, who was a famous professor of history in Mexico, who travelled halfway around the world to do the interview before Pablo died. The final thing, there's so much about Pablo that I think, is about his thinking that I haven't touched, but in the end, he was quite pessimistic, although with a dash of optimism. We are now entering a new historic period, he said in 1992, facing either unprecedented liberation, he believes utopia was possible, at least in Europe, or a descent into the worst barbarism. And we live in the age of the Palestinian genocide and the age of climate change and climate breakdown. And I think, and we live in the age of Trump, that's a quite prescient prediction. It's a kind of version of Rosa Luxemburg's final words that what we face, what humanity faces, is a choice between barbarism and socialism. All right, I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Hall,
I'm sorry I took so long.
I had to employ my democratic centralist tendencies to bring us to premature.
I know, but then you got overruled by the masses, which is good. So there was some self-management. Thank you very much over there.
Okay.
But I don't know for the rest of you all, thank you, but I do. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a zillion questions, but since I've got the mic, I might kickstart them off. What were the relations of Pablo with Marshal Tito? Because he was also a strong proponent of the non-aligned movement, and his brand of socialism did use self-management theory as well. So, yeah.
Well, he was a great admirer of and a supporter of the Yugoslavs, but he was also a critical admirer because the self-management in Yugoslavia was in the factories and in the offices and schools and so on, but there was still a party monopoly, a single-party dictatorship. And so the state and politics generally wasn't subject to self-managed or democratic socialism. And so he was a critic in that way. But when, after the coup, and Ben Bella went to prison and people were afraid that he was going to get murdered in prison, Pablo decided to organise an escape bid. The first person he went to see was Tito. And Tito said, yes, but I'll only support it if Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt at the time, supports it as well. So somebody went to see Nasser, and Nasser said yes. And then they went to see Fidel Castro. And Pablo believed that Fidel Castro then tipped off Colonel Boumediene that this was afoot. And so the rescue operation didn't occur. But no, and then the Yugoslav revolution was an extraordinary event, equal to the Greek resistance in its way. Yeah, so he was a critical supporter and sympathiser with the Yugoslavs.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the audience? With that, with that arms faction in Morocco, the Moroccan authorities, they knew nothing about it as well, or how did it escape their eyes?
I think the Moroccan authorities turned a blind eye to it. They must have known. But in the Invisible Factory, he talks about visits from, and there was some elaborate staging where they had curtains, and whenever there was a visitor from outside, all the machines would stop, everybody would remain silent, and some kind of theatrical kind of camouflage was put up at the front of the office, the front of house, which made it look as though it was a jam factory, because the factory itself was situated in a very large orange orchard, and all the signage on it was that it was a jam factory, and so the front of house would have had tins or jars of marmalade and jams out the front, so that this, so it was pretty, it was, and it was awful living there really, because as he makes clear is they were industrial prisoners. They couldn't go into town. It was very rare that they were allowed to organise, and the boundaries were patrolled by armed Algerian guards, make sure nobody got out. Because if somebody got out and then was discovered, and then he said, I work in this factory producing arms, then the Moroccans may have had to do something about it, or the French may have heard about it, or whatever. So these 400 people, including the 30 Latin Americans and Europeans who were working there, were there for 2 or 3 years.
Well, something you didn't cover, probably would require at least another lecture or several lectures, that during that time, Pablo also had a lot of sort of disagreements with, let's say, other international Trotskyist figures. Could you sort of summarise some of those differences in sort of 2 minutes or less? Or?
Yes, well, first one was in the early 50s, where Pablo thought it was very important for Trotskyists to join the main parties of the working class.
No, just come a bit closer to the mic.
Yeah, sorry, the main parties of the working class, what he called entrism sui generis. It was an exotic name and showed that he was only talking to intellectuals, talking in Latin. Entrism sui generis, that they should join the main political parties and work in those. And that split the Trotskyists at the time, because it was considered that he was liquidating Trotskyism, was unacceptable revisionism and so on. And the second one was, which got himself expelled, was he got into an argument with the other leaders of the Trotskyists over who to support in the conflict between Mao and Khrushchev, between the Russians and the Chinese. They wanted to support the Chinese, but for Michel, the Chinese were terrible Stalinists, and so he couldn't support them. And at least in the Soviet system, there was some kind of liberalisation going on. There were some prospects of change, and so he thought it was foolish to be backing the more conservative and retrograde side in the dispute. And for that, he got expelled for indiscipline because he wouldn't publicly agree with that line and continued to write analyses that ran counter to the official line. So, it was, and then there were more involved in that. He was also advocating self-managed socialism, which was a step too far for the more traditional conservative Trotskyists. And so he did have his disagreements, and he was considered to be a very divisive figure in the Trotskyist movement.
It's only a short question. It was a very good presentation, and I'm certainly going to buy the book. You packed a lot into it, so I appreciate how much energy that takes, memory and verbally. But I wanted to ask about those publications in which he writes about the liberation of women, the early ones, the French ones.
Yeah, French.
And what I want to know is, have they been translated?
Yes.
Because I would love to get my hands on them.
If afterwards, if you give me your address,
I shall.
I'll send you a copy, because it was published in French. I don't know if it was published in Greek, but it was published in French in 1960, and then 5 years later, it was published in Sydney in English, and it was Nick Origlass who did one of his schoolboy translations. But it's perfectly readable and so on, but it's not the best of it.
But it seems like there was a continuing interest in that area over the years, and so there were the later publications. So are they available?
Yes, they're all available. I have copies of most of his writings, his French writings, and most of his English, and all English translations. But what hasn't been done is translations of his Greek, except for 1 year in 1990, for some reason, somebody translated all his Greek columns for that year into French, and that exists. I don't know if you read French.
No, not much. Not much.
Yeah. So stuff. But if you give me your address, I'll make sure you get that essay. It's extraordinary.
Thanks for the talk. The relationship with Andreas must go back to Andreas' early Trotskyist youth.
That's right.
He was 8 years younger than Pablo, and that's why his dad sent him to the States during the dictatorship back in 38, 39. Now, after the December 1944 uprising in Greece, the Cambriana, the French government rescued quite a few up-and-coming Greek intellectuals, young intellectuals. Ioannis Xenakis with a ship from New Zealand, Matarao, I cannot recollect the name. Ioannis Xenakis was one of them. I believe Castoriadis was another one. Historians, philosophers, and they did live in Paris from the mid-40s onwards. Was the relationship, have you come across a relationship between Pablo and all these people who were his juniors in terms of age?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Cornelius Castoriadis is one of them you mentioned. He was a Trotskyist, in fact, and he was in the Fourth International. And again, going back to Nick's question, it's such a complicated history. He split from the Fourth International in 1948, and the big argument was over the nature of the Soviet Union. And Castoriadis came to the conclusion that it was a new kind of bureaucratic totalitarian society. The British Trotskyists tended to believe it was a state capitalist society, but at that stage, Pablo thought it was a degenerate worker state. That was the formulation. That it had all the essentials of socialism, except it had a bureaucracy ruling it, but that bureaucracy was going to be swept away. So it was a degenerate worker state. And so that was thrashed out at the 1948 Second International Conference of the Fourth International. And the Pablo side won, Pablo and Mandel, and Castoriadis and Claude Lefort split away and created Socialism or Barbarism, which was a very important magazine in France for a long time. And Castoriadis was a very important philosopher and psychiatrist in French intellectual circles. And the British split away too and formed International Socialists, which people like Christopher Hitchens was a member of. So yes, that happened then. But Pablo knew all those people, and what's his name, Callas, the poet, Nicholas Callas. They had big correspondence. They were friendlier than he was with. But funny thing is, 20 years later, but by early 1970s, Pablo had come to agree with Castoriadis of 1948 on what the nature of the Soviet Union was, which is ironic. But of course, when he talked about it, he didn't talk about Castoriadis, he talked about agreeing with Natalia Sedov, who was Trotsky's widow. She left the Fourth International in 1950 over this very question. As far as she was concerned, the Soviet Union had nothing to do with what socialism was, and to call it a worker state was a travesty, because workers had less rights in the Soviet Union than they had in capitalist countries. And so she denounced them for continuing to call it a worker state and left. 1972 or 73, Pablo agreed that Natalia was right. He didn't add that so was Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort. But yeah, it's a complicated. So he was very friendly with Natalia. You read it in the book. And when she visited Paris, she stayed with and looked up Michel and Elly. And I suppose they were kind of leftist aristocrats altogether, so they went to the same restaurants and liked the same food and so on, and same clothes. She was an art historian, and Natalie, his wife, Natalia, his wife.
Trotsky's
Trotsky's wife, yeah.
I think you covered everything, but there was one thing that I wanted to point out. I think he was accused of being the leader of the 17th of November because in I'm sure he must have known Yotopoulos in Paris, and his wife Beyno, as most intellectuals and friends of mine who lived in Paris. They knew him, they all knew each other. They were teaching at universities, and in fact, we saw his wife during the trial. She was going through hell. I think that's the reason he was accused, because of his
connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
Remember I told the story about when he was going back to where the Gestapo were and the woman passed him on the street. He then went to stay with what's his name?
Yotopoulos. Yeah. I'm sure they were friends. That's why he was accused.
They were in he was doing some teaching, but they were also making soap to sell on the markets in Paris at that time, he and his wife. But Pablo and Elly went to stay with them while they were in hiding from the Gestapo.
Small world.
So it was a small world. Yeah. And because he knew that, the son, in fact, as it turned out, was the leader of November 70s.
No, the
son. Yeah, the son of. The son. Yeah, the son.
The son of Yotopoulos.
Yeah, Yotopoulos. Yeah, he was the son.
Oh, he knew the father. Thanks
he knew
for that.
The father.
Oh, he knew the father, not the son.
The father had been the leader of the archived Marxists.
Right.
In Greece. It's complicated, but they did know each other,
Yeah, this is such a brilliant lecture. Thank you so much. I could ask you 1,000 questions, but
the book will answer all the questions.
Someone who's not a democratic centralist?
Okay. What's interesting, all is there seems to be an interest from Australian Trotskyists with Michel Pablo. I mean, you mentioned you obviously have an interest. You've written a book. Nick Origlas, who's written a book. And then you also mentioned Dennis Freeney, who was a Trotskyist and then joined the CPA afterwards, okay? Right. So is there any reason why three well-known Australian political figures showed such interest in this gentleman here, and whether or not he had an understanding of what was happening here in Australia? Did he ever comment, did he ever write on the Australian conditions here, from what you know?
No, I mean, I put the Australian connection down to the particular genius of Australian lefties. No, it was, I mean, sorry.
That's going to lead to another question now, you know.
Oh, very good. It's just one of those accidents of history, I think. I mean, Alan Roberts, there was another, Alan and Sophie, they went to Paris for a year in 1971. So there were, and it was Alan that convinced Pablo about the ecological crisis and so on, and convinced him that that was an important question in the 20th and the 21st century. But no, it's just one of those accidents of history. And the thing Nick Origlas always claimed was he was a practicing Pabloite before there was such a thing, that he was a real socialist democrat, that when he worked in the shipyards, whenever an issue arose, what did Nick Origlas do? He called a general meeting of the workers. Everybody down tools and we'll have a meeting to decide our position on this particular political question. The union bureaucrats hated him because they never knew what was going to happen in the shipyards, because bloody Origlas, he's called another mass meeting, and they decided to go on strike for a week or whatever. So Nick always considered himself an ultra-democrat, and so somebody who...
Nick Origlas you're talking about.
Nick Origlas considered himself an ultra-democrat.
You mentioned that you were a member of the Australian Labor Party. Yeah. You mentioned you were a member of the Greens. I don't think you no longer are a member of the Greens.
I am still a member.
Oh, you are still a member of the Greens. So where did the Trotskyist element come in? Were you at any stage involved with the Trotskyist movement here?
I joined the Australian Trotskyists in...
Which part of there was lots of...
at that stage there was one. There was the Australian section of the 4th International.
In
1965.
Okay. When
I joined it. There was just one organisation.
Okay.
I was a member for about 3 months before I was expelled.
You did well. You lasted 3 months. Congratulations. We've heard of splits in 2 weeks in some organisations, so that's all right.
I should add that the majority of the Australian section were expelled simultaneously because we were supporters of Pablo. So when Pablo was expelled, we were automatically expelled as well. And so that was the first split. And so there was the Mandel regular Fourth International, and there was the Nicaraglas Pablo faction for a while. So that's when it started. So I had a very brief experience in the traditional Trotskyist movement.
But you're still a member of the Greens.
Yeah,
I thought
well,
I had the impression.
I got expelled from the
you left
Labor
with.
Party.
Okay,
So
I
I
had the impression you left with Lee Rhiannon. That's why.
No.
Okay.
No, I got expelled from the Labor Party, and then we decided we had a lot in common with the German Greens, and so not anymore, but we did then. And so we decided to form the Greens in Australia. That's another story.
Okay.
But Nick might get me back to lecture on that.
Okay. Do we have a final
This is
question?
Helen, did you?
Any?
Nick, she's got one more question.
Yeah. Come.
What happened to his connections with Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir?
Well, the French intellectuals, again, small community, and they knew each other. But the thing about Sartre and de Beauvoir, they were closer to the French Communist Party than they were to the Trotskyists. And the only thing I found of Michel's about those two, well, he did a review of the Mandarins in 1955, in which he praised the book as a novel and thought it was particularly lousy as the politics involved in it. And so the first couple of paragraphs about what a great writer and novelist and observer of humanity are, but what lousy politics she and her characters have, because at that stage she was close to the French Communist Party, which was pretty Stalinist at the time. So that's all. But yeah, I mean, again in the book, the whole Daniel Guérin, who was also a major figure, anarchist figure in French intellectual life, he and Pablo were like that. But Guérin himself wrote things about Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Yeah. And the other thing is terrible. When he mentioned all the great feminists and the great feminist writings in the pamphlet, you'll see Simone de Beauvoir does not get a mention.
Sorry?
Simone, she doesn't get a mention. She doesn't get a mention, despite the second sex and despite the fact that she was a pioneer. It's something I would have liked to have asked him why he never mentioned her.
Well, it was
Good question.
affiliations again. It's the affiliations.
Yeah, it's affiliations. And, you know, the left is, they're good haters.
No.
No, sorry.
Okay.
The Greeks would know that better than I. Yeah.
We love everyone. So
Yes, I love it. Yeah. Well, there's two Greek communist parties and so on. Anyway, you know all that. Yeah. Oh, there's more than two. Yeah.
Okay. I think we need to bring things to a close. A big round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you.
And I encourage you all to buy the book and hope to see you
So
here
do
next
I.
week as well. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank
Just
you,
a
Nick, and thank you all for
Just a
coming.
small gift for appreciation.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you.